Welcome to PitchBoxing. Myself, Martin Theobald, and delighted to be joined by resident expert Gareth A. Davis. Gareth, how are you?
I'm very well, Martin. It's an absolute pleasure to be on with you. PitchBoxing, we both work for, and it's been a rather interesting day, actually.
Hasn't it just? So for those that are unaware, which I'm sure will be very few within the boxing community, probably one of the most hyped and biggest events in boxing this year happened on a radio station this afternoon. Well, this morning, wasn't it? 11 o'clock when Eddie Hearn joined Simon Jordon for two people who have shot at each other from a distance in the past and finally sat in a room together and went through everything. Now, before we go into the nitty-gritty and the detail of what was discussed, I wanted to get your take on why you think that happened. And I've got my own view of it. But why do you think that happened now? Because there have been plenty of opportunities that could have happened before, and they built it up quite nicely, almost like boxing should do, to eventually get two people together. What do you think was the purpose of doing it today?
Well, I think we've got to add that Jim White was there, and thank God he was there as well.
Yes.
On the White and Jordan show. He chaired it beautifully because it was very personal at times between Simon Jordon and Eddie Hearn, and he'd perhaps quite deliberately and painstakingly, Simon Jordon called out Eddie Hearn for a long time, and in a way had to take Eddie Hearn on today and take him to task over all the things that he'd kind of pilloried him for. Like, he'd called him a coward in the past, he'd called him a snakeskin salesman, an oily snakeskin salesman. He said that Eddie was morally wrong for trying to continue with the Conor Benn fight when it should have been called off, and I do agree with him on that. So this has been a long process of calling Eddie out, and Eddie had to perhaps bite the bullet and go in and do this. It was meant to be for 60 minutes. They went 90 minutes because they were at loggerheads. It got very personal at times, with Eddie claiming at one point that Simon Jordon had gone bankrupt, but he went into administration. He took Crystal Palace into administration. That was clarified. Simon didn't like that. They're both very articulate, very strong characters. You can even call them egos, if you like. So it was always going to be a battle of wit and will and witticisms, maybe. Simon's a very great argument. He has great argumentation over things that he feels strongly about, and Eddie has a very strong line in everything he does, and he's very light on his feet and is able to manipulate situations. But he was called manipulative today as well. It's a very strong word, but most promoters are manipulative in that if their guy is there, they're with their guy. If he's on the other side with another promoter, he's in the other corner, he's the opposition. Why do I think it happened today? Why do I think Eddie Hearn took up the invitation? Well, there's a little matter. Monday next week is Anthony Joshua Fight Week against Jermaine Franklin. The tickets for the O2 Arena haven't been selling too well. AJ is in a rebuilding process. Been on a call with him tonight with a few others, and he looks in a fantastic place. He is perfectly poised to start the last phase of his career in a fight with Jermaine Franklin. It's gone under the radar. So Eddie Hearn, clever promoter that he is, said, yeah, I'll come in midweek at that 11 o'clock hour where they're always talking about football, the transfer news, the managers being sacked. Obviously, Crystal Palace have lost their manager today, haven't they?
Well, they've appointed Roy Hodgson today, haven't they?
And they've appointed 75-year-old Roy Hodgson, who is a Crystal Palace fan, of course. So it was perfect timing for Eddie to talk about AJ, which he did today. So for him, look, he doesn't care what Simon Jordon says about him. But if someone attacks you and harangues you enough, you're going to take some kind of action against them, or you just ignore them altogether. It doesn't really matter in truth, what Simon Jordon says about Eddie Hearn. Eddie Hearn is one of the principal promoters in the world. Simon Jordon has a massive platform and very strong views and a lot of followers. And an interest in boxing. And we hear behind the scenes he may be going into boxing. He'd be a welcome addition to boxing, but he's certainly setting his stall out for who he's going to be rivals with. So for all those reasons, I think Eddie Hearn, has finally gone in there. And it was thoroughly entertaining when Simon let Eddie speak in the first 45 minutes. Simon almost didn't want it. He had so much to say and so much vim and zeal for whatever Eddie was about to say. He almost didn't let him finish a sentence. But in the end, they had some very lively debate. But I do feel that there is still a lot of things to be answered after that 90 minutes on air.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, going back to why today, my views echo yours somewhat. I think it hasn't been the greatest week for DAZN if you are a subscriber, in that you've lost Joshua Buatsi, you've got Okoli coming up on Sky, who's just recently walked away from DAZN. You have that AJ fight coming up. You've also got DAZN, in better news for them, being available on a linear TV platform now on Sky. And Eddie was very careful to make sure that was mentioned at least once during the interview, along with the Sky channel. At one point, I think I looked on YouTube, they had 45,000 people watching the YouTube channel. Add in how many...
It broke the records. It broke the records for live YouTube on TalkSport today, which is fantastic, yeah.
Add in how many people in their workplaces, how many people in their cars. That's a lot of ears that would have heard about AJ's upcoming fight against Jermaine Franklin on April the 1st, as you said. The new DAZN platform on Sky Sports. There was, in my view, no downside to Eddie Hearn going on that today, because everything that was discussed has been, like, Simon Jordon, for as good as an argumentative individual he can be, and at constructing an argument, could not create a new argument that we haven't heard already. And in my view, purely my view, he failed to press on some of the moments where perhaps we could have found out more. For instance, the cease and desist letters. For instance, that 5-week period between the board knowing and the board cancelling. Those areas we didn't really find anything out about, that actually we still don't know anything about. That first 45 minutes, it almost felt like...
It was all Conor Benn, wasn't it? It was all Conor Benn. And the Conor Benn saga.
Yeah, and there wasn't enough space for Hearn to maybe trip himself up, because every time
that was Jordan's mistake. That was Jordan's mistake.
Yeah,
Jim White brought it around again and I completely agree with you. In my notes here, what we did start to hear from Eddie, the things that all those things that he said today about the 5-week hiatus, about the board taking no action, about the board not responding properly, about whether there was cease and desist in the background. We've had that kind of conversation, deeper than that, with Eddie Hearn, with a group of national newspaper reporters under Chatham House rules for 45 minutes about, I want to say last October, when Ben surrenders his licence. In fact, Ben had surrendered his licence that afternoon, after we sat with Eddie Hearn. Half of it was on the record and half of it wasn't. And the stuff that was off the record, so I'm not going off the record here, but basically a lot of that stuff has come out since. And Eddie Hearn is saying there is an issue with the board in that they didn't do anything in those 5 weeks, say the fight is off. Why didn't they? And I think the board needs to answer that as well. That there wasn't maybe decisions with alacrity, a lack of a moral compass on everybody's side, because it was such a huge fun. Wanted to see it, but we have to go back to the cradle of what boxing is, which is an inherently dangerous combat sport where you can render your opponent unconscious and where anyone can legally die in the ring. So therefore, when someone has a banned substance, and there are banned substances for a reason, performance-enhancing drugs, they're banned so that you cannot go in and enhance your body in the event that you're going to do catastrophic damage or irreparable damage to your opponent. This is the issue here. It's not Conor Benn and Eddie Hearn. They are the conduits for a much bigger story, a much bigger narrative, which is the safety in the cradle of the sport itself. So the biggest issue being discussed there, like you say, there wasn't a step backwards to remind Eddie that the problem, instead of all the detail, they got in the weeds, didn't they, for a long time today? And we didn't get, let's just step back for a minute. The problem here is he hasn't really been exonerated. Why are you moving the fight on and saying he's going to fight Chris Eubank, he's the favourite? Could be Cal Brook, could be Christopher Eubank Jr. again, or it could be Manny Pacquiao. Looks like June, United States or the Middle East, but not the UK. Clearly, where he should have been pursued is, why are you not clearing his name in the UK in front of the Boxing Board of Control? And that is the central issue to it all. But that wasn't discussed enough today, frankly.
Yeah, it was skirted over very briefly. Again, Eddie will quickly go behind the fact that there is the legal ongoing case, of which, go back to that Conor Benn Piers Morgan interview. We were told there wasn't an ongoing legal case. We were told that there was about to be one, but we've been told that for the best part of about 3 months.
Well, we've been told that Ben is suing the Boxing Board of Control. For what exactly? The exact words from Hearn today is, he is in a legal position with the BBBFC. Yeah? So what they're doing is they're using loopholes not to discuss certain things.
Yes.
The board won't talk about those 5 weeks either. The board is saying, yeah, but we had no contact with them. Somewhere, someone down the line has not taken the requisite action that they should have taken, which is to have a hearing behind closed doors before that fight went ahead. And then they either had a case to say there's been a mistake here, or they had to, with strict liability, make a decision, call the fight off, say that he's going to have to serve a suspension or a ban, whatever you call it. This has been found, whether he proclaimed his innocence or not, because there is a strict liability. And I do think, if I can suggest, Martin, that, because it's a very complex issue, it has become a very complex issue, that I think there's a legal case around UKAD and the Boxing Board of Control, and I think they will change their rulings on this, and I think this is what Robert Smith has been on about, that they do accept all VADA findings, which they haven't in the past, because it's UKAD, the testing bodies, and that will be disputed, I'm sure, by, well, not sure, but I suspect that that's being disputed by Ben's lawyers as well, because they've thrown the VADA tests into contention, haven't they? Even though he had an out, if I can call it that, with the eggs explanation from his nutritional diet with the WBC. It's a very complicated issue. It's far more complicated than it should be, frankly. And I think they kind of lost track of that a little bit today, because it got very personal, didn't it?
They did. And to me, the one thing that you can hang the entire argument, the entire piece on, you have a boxer who's got 2 failed tests, who has only been cleared in a sense of, we can't fundamentally, categorically prove that you intended to take it and therefore it's in your system, eggs, to which Conor Benn disputes that. And he disputes that this was even in his system, despite the fact that science telling us it was. Why, from a moral perspective, are you doing everything you can at this point to push this fighter into a fight, when actually there's a massive grey cloud that hangs above all of it, which that was, to me, rather than, and it almost suited Eddie Hearn, I think, to make it personal and make it nitty gritty around bankruptcy, around business. And, having, yes, he had to back down and say, no, okay, sorry, I apologise, you weren't declared bankrupt. But in almost eking that time out of the interview, he was able to swerve some of that deeper conversation around the moral perspective.
Yeah. Well, Jordan did get his point in, and he was absolutely right, and I maintain he is right, that Eddie's morally wrong for pressing on with a Benn fight with one of those three people that I mentioned. And if it's Chris Eubank, it just brings the whole issue up again. And it's a, you know, there will be so many eyes on that fight, but it will be controversial for all the wrong reasons, frankly. As he said, he's not going to have it in the UK under a different licensing authority. What I did hear for the first time in my notes here from Eddie Hearn was that he does believe the board made the right decision. Yes, they did. He regrets saying, there is regret over him saying on the Wednesday, we're considering our options, because he should have seen, like morally, as we're saying, that, you know, you can't go on with a fight when it's been made clear that you can't push on with a fight when it's been made clear that a boxer's got a banned substance in his body.
And I would like to know on that point, if I was Simon Jordon, I would want to know what were your options. Now, I can only second guess and say perhaps it was Bieber, perhaps it was Luxembourg. I want to know who that was, because who out there in the world of boxing, and I'm not saying it was Bieber, and I'm not saying it was the Luxembourg Commission, but who was it? Because
he would have spoken to several commissions, I'm sure, and also, you know, I have it on good authority that, you know, there was a moment where they were headed to court with all their lawyers on respective sides, Boxing Board of Control, and Hearn's lawyers and Wasserman's lawyers, and, you know, I think the bottom line here is, you know, I remember speaking in depth with Spencer Oliver about this, and Spencer, you know, a good friend of mine, I worked with him professionally, you know, on several fronts, as you have, and you know, he had a brain hemorrhage, and, you know, he's recovered now 25 years later, but he said it best to me, and I won't forget the expression, you know, because it was very emotive coming from Spencer, and it's, you can't choose wealth over health, and especially in the fight sport, and it's such a rich fight between, I mean, I'm more interested in Conor Benn and Kell Brook and Conor Benn and Chris Eubank as a fight aficionado than I am Conor and Manny Pacquiao. Doesn't work for me in some way because it's a faded great star against a very, you know, strong young fighter. Even Kell Brook is that to an element, to a degree. And I think, you know, the key thing that has come up that needs answering is, why did the board and Eddie Hearn and Matchroom and Wasserman and Eubank and Benn, as that's come out as well, this wasn't talked about today, but that's another question I think Jordan should have asked Eddie Hearn. Were you really going to give Eubank another $1 million to go ahead with the fight? You know, well, and I think that's a very interesting, because again, that's wealth over health. I don't think that fight should go ahead until there is a hearing, till he's done whatever he's got to do with the Boxing Board of Control. But those 5 weeks, Martin, where clearly there would have been legal ramifications behind the scenes, I think all sides have got questions to answer in that 5 weeks, and why it didn't come to light. And I think it will come out in the fullness of time, and it probably won't look that pretty.
And I would suspect, rightly or wrongly, that everybody is going to have an area of fault within that. Because
yeah, exactly.
If that wasn't the case, I suspect we'd know the answer right now.
But the Boxing Board of Control, the Boxing Board of Control have said they're going to change their rules. I remember sitting with Eddie Hearn where he first announced or told a group of us, I couldn't pull my fighter and cancel the fight. Well, that's not a very good contract then, is it? You know, you should have the right to be able to do that as the promoter. And you can't say it was up to the board to do it. No, they left the board to do it, in my view. Until the board did it, they didn't make a decision on it. And what angered them was, and I do get this because I went to the red carpet event on the Monday. It was amazing. On Fight Week, it was right there on the apex of Tottenham Court Road and Oxford Circus, in that brilliant new venue. I forgot what it's called, but it was amazing, the event. You know, red carpet arrival, an event upstairs. And, you know, they went to great expense, great length to do it. And I remember watching with great alarm on the Wednesday, I think it was, when they had the workouts. Conor Benn still doing interviews and Chris Eubank Jr. Doing interviews and then working out. And it just seemed ludicrous, you know?
Yeah, it was. I was watching it, and it was Chris Lloyd who was doing the interviews
Yeah,
with two of them live on DAZN on their YouTube channel. It was quite egregious to do it, in my view. With everything
painful,
going on,
painful.
it was the only moment throughout all of this entire process that I've had a sympathy towards Conor Benn, because I thought
Oh,
this is a young man that is probably going through turmoil. Whether it's his fault, whether it's not, I don't. None of us can really tell. Probably the one thing he doesn't need right now is this. To be put in front of a camera and ask questions, probably with lawyers speaking to him 5 seconds before he goes on camera, telling him what he can and can't say. Yeah, no, that to me wasn't pretty.
but
But
Conor Benn has stuck to his guns, and as Eddie Hearn said today with Simon Jordon, I believe the young man. I don't have to, but I do. I've seen him several dozen times, or whatever, how many times he said today. I believe him. Now, Conor Benn has stuck to his guns. You have to say that, and maintained that he is innocent the entire way through this. He, knowingly or unknowingly, you know, bodybuilders will tell you different. That it's too difficult to take this stuff, and you know, there's all manner of ins and outs of this. It's so deep in the weeds. It's such a malaise. It's been a very dark cloud over boxing. It feels like it's been dragged through the mud, and that we're not getting. And I think that did speak clearly for itself today when Eddie Hearn said, "I'm pressing on with Conor Benn's career." That, you know, where is the moral compass in boxing? You know, where is the testing system? Boxing Board of Control are going to change their rules as well. I think they will have it in their rules that other testing bodies, when their tests come forward, they will accept them immediately. They've got to move quicker with things. You know, what was this 5-week hiatus? That there are questions to answer. It's a riddle inside an enigma right now.
do you think the board will take issue with anything that Hearn said today? Because there are a couple of times that I thought, oh, like that's a little bit close to the bone. Now, I also appreciate it's a case of the tail wagging the dog somewhat with Hearn and the board. He pays them a lot of money per year, and therefore, without him, the board, have less resource. So he can probably get away with a little bit more than, say, a Steve Goodwin, a Steve Wood, or something like that. It doesn't fund the board as much as Eddie does. But there were times that I thought, Eddie's a very sensible man. Eddie's a very wise man. He won't say anything, I'm sure, that will get him in legal trouble. But there's always that clause in the little green book that the board give out about bringing the sport into disrepute and having the right to kind of bring you in front of them if you've said something online or in person that doesn't look good for the sport. There were various things that I thought today, that is bringing the sport into disrepute.
Well, as Jordan said, you know, and it was a very bold thing to say, and that Eddie Hearn should be up on a disrepute charge with the Boxing Board of Control over his handling of things that week. I mean, it did beg a belief that 30 hours we waited for them to cancel the event. I mean, I remember waiting there with all the other media. I think it's the Plaza Hotel, one of the hotels right there on the edge of Canary Wharf. And Eddie and Calla Sauerland came and made a statement. Must have been 4:35 p.m. in the evening on I want to say the Thursday. It might have been the Wednesday. I lose track of which day it was now, but it was certainly a long time after the board had made their statement and cancelled or said that they would not sanction the event. But in those 30 hours, there was the speculation of what might have gone on. I think Hearn is probably very angered by the board's, as he keeps going back to, I keep repeating this, what are you going to do, he said today on the show, to Robert Smith, 5 weeks later, they pulled the fight. They waited 5 weeks for the board to react. What we don't know is what was going on behind the scenes. And there's a lot unsaid that will have gone on behind the scenes. Rather like, I can recall, I've probably spoken to Robert Smith 3 times a week for the last 3 months, and 4 months, sorry, and about this case. And there's very little they can say. We're still waiting for documentation, they say. They're still waiting for that 270-page report. I'm so surprised that they aren't sending it, because I'm sure that they're not looking to ban Conor Benn for life. But he believes the board have a vendetta against him in some way. That's what he believes. He may never box in the UK again. And he won't, of course, until they see that report. I mean, Eddie Hearn, does he sail close to the wind? No, I don't think so. I think he's very sensible today. But there are clearly signs that there was a breakdown in communication between both sides. And also, by the way, remember, he's separating himself from being Ben's advisory team around this and being his promoter and sticking with him. So he's removed himself a stage away from what the board and their lawyers are dealing with Ben and his lawyers. Eddie Hearn has removed himself from that situation. He said the information doesn't come from him. It has to come from Conor Benn's lawyers to the board.
And he plays that both ways as well.
Yeah.
In that he made the statement today about there is the ongoing legal case, which again, if there is an ongoing legal case, then I am 99.9% sure that 270-page dossier would have had to have been provided to the board.
I don't think so. I really don't think so. That's my understanding. There is ongoing legality, definitely, between the Boxing Board of Control and Conor Benn's lawyers. No question about it. However many lawyers there are, or levels of lawyers, or groups of lawyers, I
would question them, and I realise this, whether you do or don't know and would be able to say right now are two different things, but what on earth is that legality around at present? And I realise that there might be stages of it. It might be that you even have 10 different cases going on. I don't know. I mean, he's got the cases that were issued by the board against him, which are separate licensing issues.
They're disrepute charges, aren't they?
Yeah. So my point would be that if any of these are to do with the drugs case and not necessarily about financial compensation, which may be an entirely separate thing.
I think it probably is, Martin. I think they're probably entirely separate. There are. My understanding is that there are more than
the burnings.
There is not just one case; it's several. Yeah, over different matters. Yeah,
I would assume at some point during the discovery phase of those, the board will have to say, "Fine, well, send us your dossier."
Yeah.
And at that point, he has to do it, and pride will not be a backup. Pride will not be an option as to why you can't send it.
But he's in limbo. At the moment. Yeah, there's partly pride, like you're saying. But he's in limbo, isn't he? Because he's surrendered his license. There's no suspension. The board say they're waiting for his documentation, but they aren't sending it. But there are ongoing cases around, why he's around his disrepute, and the charge, not charges, but the reasons they've brought forward against him. They upheld the case against him, didn't they? They upheld them in last October, and he surrendered his license. He didn't appear, but his lawyers did for him. So in a weird way, he's in limbo with the Boxing Board of Control. It's a loophole to get around the system, because you can go and be licensed somewhere else. I don't think Nevada would license him. I don't think California would license him. I don't think New York would license him. The British Boxing Board of Control helped the Saudi Arabian Boxing Authority get set up. Robert Smith and others have been instrumental in helping their authorities. But there are authorities out there that are going to license him. Texas might license him. Florida might license him. There are places that will. Their commissions of their own kind of volition. You know, they're seconded government agencies, aren't they? But I think what it all points to is we need a bigger authority in boxing than commissions. We do need a world governing body. There's no question, because they would be able to rule on this. And the route that Conor Benn should be taking right now, I think I'm going to call him Michael Jordan. Simon Jordon has brought up before, and I completely agree with him, and have spoken about this myself, is take your case to the Boxing Board of Control. This is what I think Eddie should be pushing him to do as well, as a promoter. And if you are unhappy with the resolution, take it to the Court of Arbitration in Sport and get their resolution on it as well.
And circling it all the way back round to today in the interview, if you could, as a final point, if you could have either asked / reiterated / drilled down into one point, or asked one other point that wasn't perhaps picked up on today, what would you have liked to have seen Simon Jordon quiz Eddie on a little bit more?
Well, I want to mention before I answer that is that he did speak about Anthony Joshua, and that he's got to win against Jermaine Franklin, which was interesting, and I'm sure everybody agrees with that, and that there's 3 opponents out there if he gets the victory: Deontay Wilder, Tyson Fury, and Dillian Whyte. The biggest question was, how on earth can you be announcing that he's going to go ahead and have a fight in June when he has not cleared his name with the British Boxing Board of Control? It's a huge gaping hole in this whole saga, that you have absolutely bypassed the authority under which he was going to have this fight and who called this fight off. How can you morally do that? I mean, he was called morally wrong, but how can you morally take that stance and do that when he has not cleared his name here? He hasn't cleared his name.
Yeah, and I could, or I would be inclined to back that up with the fact that for 30 hours post the board cancelling the fight, you were going to put it on anyway.
Yeah, so he hasn't moved on, even though there's regret. Yeah, in the sense he hasn't moved on. So he, even though he says he was considering his options.
And he says, yes, in hindsight, we may have handled it badly, and perhaps I would change the way that I dealt with it at the time, but I was under huge pressure and there were cameras on me, That stance has not changed.
No, that's the point. That's the biggest point of what came out today. We're going ahead regardless. We're going ahead regardless. And in a way, it throws the testing system under the bus, And as I said before, boxing has to have a testing system that has veracity and that has strength and that has authority in the inherently dangerous combat sports world that we love.
Yeah. It throws the testing system and the regulation systems in the bin at that point. And I think, that point to me didn't get laboured enough today.
No.
I think perhaps, as you say, got down into the nitty gritty and into the weeds of.
And it got personal as well, didn't it?
A bit uncomfortable at times, but they're both big men. I'm sure they're used to, they've had worse online and they've had bigger.
Had a lot worse than that. They had a lot worse than that.
There was probably a gentleman's agreement at some point.
I doubt it. No, I doubt it. But Eddie Hearn stayed for 90 minutes instead of an hour, so he got comfortable in the chair. He never looked uncomfortable.
No, I agree. There wasn't an obvious winner out of it, which I think people were maybe.
I always said split draw anyway, or majority draw. So,
Gareth, that's been fantastic. Thank you for your input and your insight, and you've always got those valuable background bits as well that you can add to these conversations. So, I hugely appreciate it.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Martin.
Excellent. You take care, Gareth.